Guardians of the B.L.A.D.E. by Adalene Martis, Chapter 2. I Don't Want to Smell You. Leaving the freezer, Therak made his way back towards command. As he walked past the room where Nyra was confined, a soft voice reached his ears. "Hello?" she called hesitantly. There was a note of uncertainty, perhaps even hope. He paused for the briefest of moments, but did not respond. Resolutely he continued down the corridor, the sound of her voice fading behind him. In the control room, he initiated lockdown protocol. His fingers moved deftly over the console, and the facility's defenses whirred into action. Thick barriers reinforced the exterior door, active stealth systems activated, and a sensor suite searched the skies above. The systems hummed with energy, yet he couldn't shake the unease settling in his chest. Nyra's revelations were a weight on his mind. Was she really telling the truth? If the war had truly ended decades ago, what did that mean for his mission, for his unwavering commitment to duty? He reviewed the communication logs once more, looking at the date of the last transmission. 30 years of silence. The realization that no messages had come through in that precise amount of time, tracked with when she had said the war ended. The isolation he had attributed to strategic necessity now seemed hollow. Standing abruptly, he left the control room. The walls felt constricting, the air thick. He needed an outlet for the turmoil raging within. Entering the gym, he approached his weights. The barbell still held all the plates, but as before, it offered little challenge. Gripping the bar tightly, he began lifting, muscles tensing and releasing in a relentless rhythm. The habitual meditative exertion provided a temporary escape from the doubts clouding his mind. Each repetition was punctuated by the clank of metal, a steady cadence that echoed in the empty space. He pulled off his shirt as he pushed himself harder, the sound of his panting drowning out the questions that refused to be silenced. Yet no matter how much weight he lifted or how fast he moved, he couldn't escape the unsettling possibility that the life he had been living was built on a lie. Nyra's voice echoed faintly through the corridors, reaching his ears even over the clanking of weights. "Hello?" she called out again, her tone aching with vulnerability. "Please, is anyone there? I need water. And I need to use the facilities." He set down the barbell, the metal plates settling with a dull thud. Wiping his hand across his chin, he stood still for a moment, conflict flickering in his eyes. Duty dictated he only have minimum contact with her. But something else, something deeper stirred within him. The prospect of someone to talk to about what had been happening all these years. Conflicted, he made his way to her holding room. The door hissed open, revealing Nyra huddled on the floor near the unused bed. Upon seeing his imposing silhouette filling the doorway, she visibly shrank, her golden eyes wide with apprehension. He gestured for her to step forward. "Come," he said curtly. She hesitated before rising slowly. As she approached, he reached out and gripped her shoulder. She let out a small, frightened sound, and he felt the tension in her slender frame. Realizing his firmness, he softened his hold, his large hand resting more gently as he guided her into the hallway. Where are we going?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The last working bathroom is this way," he replied, his tone devoid of emotion. They walked down the dim corridor, the hum of the facility's systems the only backdrop to their footsteps. The stark lighting cast long shadows. As she walked, she stole glances at Therak from over her shoulder, his stoicism etched into his features. He led her to a door and pressed a panel to open it. Inside was his personal quarters, a Spartan room, with minimal furnishings. A neatly made bed occupied one corner. A Farron flag hung on the wall beside an old photograph of soldiers standing in formation. The air carried his scent, a mix of musk and metal. He pointed towards an open door on the opposite side. "In there," he directed. She moved hesitantly, pausing at the threshold of the bathroom. Turning back to face him, she mustered the courage to ask, "Could I have some privacy?" He met her gaze evenly. "You're my prisoner," he stated bluntly. "Be quick." Her ears flattened slightly. "Right," she murmured before stepping inside. She left the door ajar, and he stood just outside. The bathroom was utilitarian, much like the rest of the facility. She undid her buttons and slipped her pants down around her ankles as she sat. A stream tinkled into the waiting water as Therak watched. Unlike the other female, she didn't have any hidden weapons that he could see. Perhaps she wasn't trying to trick him after all. He averted his eyes from her accusing gaze. Then he caught her scent, a deep, heady musk, which caused his upper lip to curl back and his mouth to open, exposing his teeth as he inhaled deeply. The scent caused his heart to race. She was in heat. Uncomfortable, Therak covered his face with his hand and turned away. While she was occupied, he busied himself at the sink in the main room. Taking a clean metal cup from a shelf, he filled it with cool water. The simple act felt strangely significant, offering a basic kindness that he wouldn't give to someone he intended to execute. When she emerged, she found him holding out the cup. Her eyes flickered with surprise. "Thank you," she said softly, accepting it with both hands. She drank greedily. He watched her silently, arms crossed uncomfortably over his chest. There was a noticeable tension between them. Handing back the empty cup, she ventured cautiously, "I didn't catch your name, guardian of the facility." He hesitated. It had been years since anyone had addressed him personally. "It's Therak," he finally said. "Therak," she repeated as if testing the sound. "I'm Nyra." He gave a curt nod. "I know." She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the photograph. "Those were your comrades." He followed her gaze. "Yes. What happened to them?" she said, seemingly eager to keep him talking. "They left," he replied tersely. She seemed to choose her next words carefully. "Why did you stay behind?" "My duty is here," he said, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. She looked at him thoughtfully. "Even after all this time? The war has been over for decades." "How did my king die?" Therak snapped, determined to take hold of the conversation. "He killed himself," she said cautiously. Therak nodded slowly, a tightness forming in his chest. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nyra thought for a while, her eyes frantic as he loomed over her. "Well," she began hesitantly, "it's been years since I studied this, but the Farron had a weapon that united everyone against them. When it was clear he would lose, your king agreed to peace talks. He agreed they wouldn't use the weapon if the Alliance didn't attack Farron territory. The Atorthan delegation demanded to be part of the peace talks, but your king refused. However, they showed up anyway. Before they could land, your king ordered everyone who knew about the weapon's location to take their own lives. It was shocking. The king and all his top staff ended their lives before anyone could stop them." As Nyra spoke, Therak felt as if the ground beneath him was giving way. A deep, resonating silence filled his mind, drowning out her words as they echoed distantly. The room seemed to narrow, his vision tunneling until only Nyra's face remained in focus, her expression uncertain and afraid. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The implications of what she was saying crashed over him like a tidal wave. The Atorthans were powerful psychics, capable of extracting secrets from the deepest recesses of the mind. His king had chosen death, over the risk of the facility's discovery. The facility that Therak had been guarding all these years. His usually steady hands began to tremble subtly. He clenched them into fists at his sides, his claws digging lightly into his palms. A knot formed in his stomach, tightening with each passing second. The weight of 3 decades pressed down upon him. The years of isolation and unwavering vigilance hadn't been wasted. Therak's breath hitched, and he took a step back, needing space to process the flood of emotions surging within him. A mixture of pride, grief, and a profound sense of purpose swirled in his heart. His king had made the ultimate sacrifice, entrusting Therak with a duty of immeasurable importance. The protection of their territory, their culture, and their entire race. Nyra approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the floor. She slowly edged around him, making her way towards the door. He reached out and put a heavy hand on her shoulder, causing her to jump. "Nice try," he said. "It's time to return you to your room." As they walked to her room, she kept glancing back. "Therak," she began softly, "this whole thing has been a horrible misunderstanding. The war is over. I have a ship. Surely you have someone back home. Friends, family. They're probably still alive. You can contact them over my communicator. You don't have to do this anymore." He stiffened but didn't reply. "Please," she pressed gently. "Just consider what I've said." They arrived at her holding room. Before he could open the door, she placed a tentative hand on his arm. He glanced down at her, surprise flashing in his eyes. "Thank you for the water," she said earnestly. He nodded slowly, a flicker of something indefinable passing between them. "Inside," he instructed. She stepped into the room and turned to face him as the door began to close. "When is dinner? Can we eat together?" She started, but her words cut off as the door sealed shut. For a moment he stood there, feeling bad about cutting her off. He could hear her soft sobs echoing out from behind the door. Poor girl. She had been trying so hard to be brave. He admired her cool head and ability to keep her captor talking while establishing a rapport. He'd learned a similar technique in resistance training back in his academy days. A civilian like her attempting such a tactic without any training or succumbing to their emotions was impressive. He'd have to keep an eye on her. Therak found himself wandering thoughtlessly back to the gym by habit. He stood by the weights, but his focus was shattered. No matter how hard he pushed himself, he couldn't escape his thoughts. He felt more justified in killing the scavengers now that he'd heard about his king's sacrifice, but their faces haunted him, especially the female. He desperately tried to think of something more pleasant. Nyra's voice entered his thoughts instead. Her offer to help him find his family was something he couldn't consider given the secrecy of his mission. He tried to console himself with the thought that she'd probably been lying and would have sent a distress beacon the second she got back on her ship. He'd be put on trial for murder shortly after. Then the Atorthans would find him. Therak shuddered at the thought of one of those ugly gray bastards crawling through his mind. There was only one choice for Therak, and that was to stay on the facility. But what about Nyra? She was young, had her whole life ahead of her. Was it fair to trap her with him there? He didn't think so. But if he released her, she'd tell others she'd seen this place. "What am I going to do with you?" he said. He thought about getting her help to repair some major systems and then letting her go. The facility would leave the planet eventually. If she behaved and helped him, he wouldn't have to worry about the facility breaking down for several more years. But there was another problem. Nyra's presence had stirred something long dormant within him, a yearning he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Her being in heat wasn't good. Right now, It was a minor inconvenience because she was probably on birth control. Almost all female Urmahs who weren't actively trying to get pregnant were on birth control to give themselves clear heads during their heats. However, if she didn't take her medication, she'd start to lose control over herself, and he didn't want to think about what would happen after that. He'd never actually met a feline who wasn't on birth control, but he'd heard stories, and he didn't want to deal with that kind of crazy, or the emotions for her that it would force him to feel. Female felines gave off pheromones that made the males around them lose control of their dignity. He sat on the weight bench, head bowed, mulling over his options until his stomach distracted him with a low growl. Deciding to put off his problems till later, he headed toward the mess hall, the prospect of fresh meat warming his spirits. Entering the mess, he moved to the freezer where the dromedary carcass awaited. With practiced efficiency, he hoisted the creature onto a metal table. Using a sharp blade, he opened an artery, allowing the blood to drain into a container. He carried the crimson liquid to the recycler, pouring it in. The machine whirred appreciatively, gobbling up the offering to convert it into the nutrient paste that had sustained him for so long. Returning to the carcass, Therak skillfully butchered the meat, setting aside choice cuts. He carved a thick, fatty steak from the hump, a rare delicacy he hadn't enjoyed in ages. Turning on the electric grill, he placed the meat onto the hot surface. The steak sizzled, releasing a rich aroma that filled the mess hall and stirred his appetite. He watched as the edges browned and the fat melted, juices seeping and sizzling. As he stood by the stove, he realized that his knee was swelling, probably from the long run and the strain of carrying the dromedary. The old injury often acted up after strenuous activity. He wouldn't be able to make another trip like that any time soon. However, fresh meat was worth the pain. Once cooked to perfection, he placed the steak on a plate. The sight and smell were almost overwhelming after years of bland sustenance. As he walked back toward his quarters, the warm plate in his hands, he allowed himself a small moment of anticipation. "Therak, did you make dinner? It smells great." Nyra's voice called out softly from behind her door. He paused mid-stride, his grip tightening on the plate. He hadn't intended to share his meal or his company. "Hello?" She tried again, hope tinged with uncertainty. With a heavy sigh, he turned and approached the holding room. Pressing the control panel, the door slid open. Nyra jumped as she took in his massive silhouette. "Drome hump, my favorite," she remarked with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Would you like to eat with me? I can tell you more about what's happened while you've been stuck here, and then we can make that call to your pride. Pherons really cherish their families, right? You must be desperate to hear something after all this time." For a moment, he was at a loss for words. Her audacity was astounding. He would have sneered at her attempt to manipulate him if it wasn't for his heart pounding in his chest as he caught her scent. Without replying, he thrust the plate toward her. She accepted it gracefully, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact sent a surprising jolt through him. "Thank you," she said softly. "Come in, let's talk." He averted his gaze, the walls he'd built around himself fortifying. "I'll be back later to take you to the bathroom," he said gruffly. Therak stepped back and pressed the door panel. As the door slid shut, Nyra's eyes widened with surprise. He walked away, her voice following him, muffled through the door. Therak, please." He quickened his pace, her words chasing after him in the quiet corridor. Returning to his quarters, he shut the door firmly behind him. He approached the nutrient paste dispenser that was on the wall next to his bed. One of the privileges of being the captain was that he didn't have to leave his quarters to eat tasteless goop. Placing his hand under the spigot, he pressed the button. A viscous, unappealing substance oozed out, its color and texture far from appetizing. He stared at it for a moment. The stark contrast to the savory steak he'd just handed over was not lost on him. With a resigned grimace, he consumed the paste, the bland taste doing little to satisfy him. The rough texture of his tongue scraped against his palm as he licked it clean. He knew what Nyra was attempting. She was trying to gain his trust so she could escape. So far, she'd been completely open about her intentions. However, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The facility he guarded was a superweapon capable of catastrophic destruction. Even if the war was over, his king had entrusted him to continue his task, to guard this hidden weapon and keep the dark cats honest. While he didn't want to keep Nyra captive, after careful consideration, he couldn't let her go either. Keeping her around was a liability because she had every reason to hate him. In addition, she was clever and would soon become desperate. While she was too small to be conventionally dangerous to him, there was no telling what she would be capable of while cornered. But the worst part of this whole situation was that she was female. He couldn't shake the image of her standing in front of him, helpless and vulnerable. While he couldn't set her free, his honor demanded that he find a way to help her feel as safe and comfortable as possible. As he tried to think of how he could possibly do that in this situation, he caught the scent of her lingering in his quarters, a delicate musk that clouded his thoughts. The image of her hips as she slid down her pants entered his mind. Frustrated, he moved to the ventilation control panel on the wall. He adjusted the airflow, increasing it to the max in hopes of clearing both the air and his mind. The vent rattled as the fan struggled to comply. With a clunk, it sputtered and stopped altogether. "Damn it!" Therak muttered under his breath. Another system failing, another reminder of the facility's gradual decline. He sank onto the edge of his bed, running a hand over his face, lines of stress deepening on his face. Staring at the blank wall, he pondered his next move. Perhaps he should determine Nyra's skills. She was, after all, the engineer on her ship, but involving her further posed risks. What if she decided to sabotage the place? Therak shook his head. She wanted to live. She wouldn't risk tearing down the facility around her. So long as he treated her well and didn't let her get too close, things should be relatively safe. But what was he going to do about her being in heat? Unbidden, his thoughts drifted to images of her body, a young feline in her prime. The assertion of the unwanted images disturbed Therak. He gritted his teeth and tried to block out her scent that assaulted his mind. Standing abruptly, he contemplated going about his routine for a distraction. There were protocols to follow, duties to fulfill. Yet, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered doubts. What was the point? For the first time in 35 years, Therak missed his nightly comms check-in. Instead, he found himself wandering to Nyra's room and escorting her to the washroom as he had promised. He kept his back steadfastly turned as she did her business. "The steak was good," she said while sitting on the pot. Therak remained silent. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest as he tried his best to ignore the heady scent of her. However, try as he might, he felt a stirring below. His pants grew tight around a swelling there. Self-conscious, he stepped away from where she could see him and tucked his erection under his belt. Unfortunately, his shirt had an exposed belly, so it didn't do anything to hide his shame. He looked down to see pink flesh towering above his pant line. Frustrated, he tucked it down instead, running along his leg. It was contained, but to his dismay, it was easily noticeable. Suddenly, a loud, forceful flush of water erupted from the bathroom as Nyra finished. Therak's body jolted in a minor panic. His eyes widened, darting frantically in search of something to cover himself with. "Therak?" said Nyra, as she poked her head out of the bathroom. He jumped at her voice and snatched the blanket from his bed, wrapping it around his waist. He glowered at her, furious and embarrassed. She quickly turned away from his dangerous expression. She looked terrified, which made Therak feel like a monster. It wasn't her fault she was in heat. "Where's your medication?" Therak asked her, attempting to make his voice as non-threatening as possible. "My what? Oh, my birth control, you mean?" she asked. He nodded and she continued. "It's on my ship. I can show you." She started making her way to the exit, but Therak got in her way. "You aren't going anywhere. It'll be dark soon, and I moved your ship far away." Nyra glanced down at Therak's sheet, then back up at his eyes. "I'd feel more comfortable if I had the pills now. Relax, I won't touch you." "I'm not that type of person," said Therak. Nyra crossed her arms over her chest. "That's what they all say," she mumbled. Therak frowned. "If you were worried about males, you should have taken a stronger dose of medicine. Your pheromones are too strong," said Therak, defensively. "I'm taking low dose for a reason, not that it's any of your business." She replied, equally defensive. Low dose meant that the feline could still inspire males, but she wouldn't get pregnant from the result. She would also stay relatively calm during her heat, enough to act sensibly. "Whatever your reason was doesn't matter. I don't want to smell you," said Therak. "You could let me go. Problem solved," she suggested. Therak grew quiet, then motioned her down the hall. She got excited for a moment until he stopped her at her room and opened the door. "Get inside," he commanded as gently as possible. "So you'll let me go later? Tomorrow?" she asked. Therak closed his eyes for a moment and let out a deep sigh. "The only way for you to leave this facility is the same way your friends did. Let me know if that's what you want. I promise I'll make it painless." Nyra's mouth hung open in shock. "Whoa, what?" "I'll give you a couple of days to make your decision," he said. He started to push her inside, but she clung to the doorframe. "Why? Why are you doing this?" A civilian like her couldn't understand why he had to make this choice, so he didn't bother explaining. He shoved her and easily broke her grip on the doorframe. Then he locked her inside. Back in his room, he flopped on his bed as the lights dimmed and the clock slipped past his bedtime. He stared at the ceiling, picturing her terrified expression and feeling miserable about what he'd done. Tomorrow, he would speak with her and try to explain things better. For now, he needed rest. Stripping off his constraining clothes, he lay down on the bed, the unfamiliar scent of her still lingering in his room. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of golden eyes and an uncertain future.